The past is illustrated by the objects left behind. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, the toppled towers of mighty Greek palaces at Knossos, and pottery and stone reliefs that depict both vast riches and endless warfare. This was the ancient world of 1300 BC, the Bronze Age, named after the metallurgy of its weapons. Stretching from Egypt to the Black Sea, the ancient world was an amalgam of disparate and powerful nations, dominated by kings and their armies. The Mycenaeans and Minoans, the heroes of Homeric legend, built their palaces in Greece, Crete, and the Aegean Islands. The pharaoh Ramses, thought to be the pharaoh cited in the Old Testament, changed the very landscape with his monument at Karnak. The warring Hittites, biblical enemies of Egypt, dominated what is now Turkey and northern Syria, while the Canaanites, the merchants of the great trade route, controlled what was to become the Holy Land, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. It was a patchwork of many kingdoms, leagues apart, distinct in design and culture. Yet when archaeologists first began excavating this territory in the 1930s, a disturbing pattern began to emerge.
What we've got is a series of destructions. Most of the main cities, towns, palaces are destroyed for one reason or another.
Evidence of destruction was widespread, and in nearly every instance, the period of the collapse was the same, the years surrounding 1200 BC.
In this 50-year period, we've got at least 4 major civilizations that go down. Mycenaeans disappear, Minoans disappear, Hittites disappear, the Canaanites to a large extent disappear, and Egypt is so weakened that it's really never the same again. That's what's so amazing about this, is these are the biggest guys in the world, and they all bite the dust at about the same time, within a generation or two.
The Ramessid period starts off very strong with some of the most spectacular building and just incredible wealth. And then there are little cracks in the whole fabric of the society. Economically, religion, you can just see things sort of going downhill. In the reign of Ramses III, there's tremendous inflation. We see the monuments become smaller in scale. We also see huge economic problems with the tax base of the country, because so much of the taxable land had been removed from the tax rolls. Many people believe that from this time, the Egyptians no longer have the great self-confidence they had before the gods. We see a whole new genre of petitions to the gods, these prayers asking for, please God, help me, which we never saw before this time.
After a century of progress, which saw the development of the first alphabetic writing in Ugarit in 1300 and the first musical notation in Syria, the written record abruptly ended. What followed has become known, ominously, as the Dark Age.
The Dark Ages in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean have 2 connotations. One is, for the ancients, they lost most of the hallmarks of civilization. It's called that in part because civilization, as we know it, disappears for a couple of hundred years. They forget how to write in Greece. They forget how to do large buildings, massive architecture. And it takes 200 or 300 years to come up out of this. But it's also a dark period for us.
Without written records, archaeologists were baffled by the evidence of mass migrations throughout the ancient world, all dating to around 1200 BC. On the island of Crete, tradesmen and merchants poured out of the coastal settlements and pushed inland to the mountainous lands worked by farmers and shepherds.
In the North Isthmus, the area right behind me here, it appears that there was almost no settlement at all, or perhaps a small scattering of small villages in the Mycenaean period. The population is very thin. By the 12th century, the population grows considerably. But where this population is coming from and why exactly is not entirely clear.
The destruction in the cities they left behind is mute testimony that this was no peaceful exodus.
It can be very difficult to determine the cause of a destruction. When you're digging, it's pretty obvious something's been destroyed. You've got fire, you've got ash, you've got burnt wood, you've got skeletons. But what actually caused the destruction?
The answer may not lie in the rubble of these palaces, but in the mountains high above them. One archaeologist has dedicated his life to following the clues, rediscovering the ancient pathways that lead up the sheer cliffs of the Aegean. It is here that he follows in the footsteps of the survivors, hoping at last to discover how and why their world collapsed. For decades, it remained a mystery. The sudden collapse of the great coastal cities and palaces of the ancient world in 1200 BC. What could have caused it? Most investigators dug for clues in the ruins of mighty cities. But the real evidence was to be found further inland, in the distant mountains and valleys of the Aegean islands, where humble farmers and shepherds once cultivated barley, lentils, and olives. It first came to light in the summer of 1983, when Polish archaeologist Krzysztof Nowicki, then a 26-year-old student, first climbed the mountain of Karfi on the island of Crete. Nowicki's original goal was to study a Neolithic religious shrine constructed on Karfi's summit by prehistoric peoples. But once there, 1,200 meters above sea level, Nowicki was drawn to another set of ruins. A mountaintop village that had been partially excavated and abandoned by the British archaeologist John Pendlebury in the 1930s. Having experienced one of the frigid winters on top of Karfi, Pendlebury concluded it was merely a temporary or seasonal settlement. But to Nowicki, the ruins made of large blocks of stone suggested something else.
What is interesting about the houses in Karfi, that they are pretty well constructed. This way of construction suggests that these people were prepared to live in this village for a long time, and that these were their permanent houses.
By mapping out and reconstructing the settlement from the excavated footprint, Nowicki confirmed his suspicion.
The excavation revealed at least 25 to 30 houses. At the moment, these remains are in a very bad state of preservation, but we still can trace the walls and we still can trace the rooms and particular individual houses. Karfi was a big village. It was not a small settlement. It was a village inhabited probably by 120 to 150 families, about 600 to 1,200 people.
The reconstructed village, 1,100 meters above sea level, seemed strangely out of place.
We should not expect a big village situated on this rock and on such altitude. Now we are sitting in the sun. There is probably 35 degrees. But if we came here in the winter, it is a very, very windy, very cold place. It is not very pleasant to live here.
Why would there be a permanent settlement so far above the usual sites on the lower hillsides and plains?
We have to ask why people move to these places, why people build their houses in the places difficult to climb up, why they decided to move their families to these houses, why they moved their entire economic system up to these places, to the high mountains.
Though Pendlebury had thought it an earlier site, Nowicki's carbon dating of pottery and other artifacts placed it squarely in the time of the Bronze Age catastrophe, 1200 BC.
before 1200 BC, we still have people living close to the sea, on the plains, in the valleys. Shortly before 1200 BC, we see that many of these low-situated places were either destroyed or abandoned.
The inevitable question was, what would force these populations to move from the coasts to the mountains? Nowitzki returned to the historical and archaeological record, but could find no consensus as to what had caused such sudden and dramatic changes.
There are all kinds of crazy theories out there to explain the end of the Late Bronze Age. Comets, volcanoes, aliens, you name it, people have said it.
But most hypotheses revolved around the ever-present threat of natural disaster.
One of the main suggestions has been drought, that there was a major drought across the entire Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, and perhaps even up to Europe, and that starts tribes migrating. The level of the water of the Mediterranean had dropped significantly at the end of the Late Bronze Age.
Another possibility was the devastating earthquakes that regularly jolt the region.
We've got a number of sites in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean destroyed by earthquake within a 50-year span at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Mycenae is destroyed by earthquake. Troy 6 is destroyed by earthquake. Ugarit may be destroyed by an earthquake. Megiddo in Israel may be destroyed by an earthquake. The problem with saying that a single earthquake destroyed all of these sites and brought the Late Bronze Age to an end is that these sites are destroyed at different times during the 50-year period.
Though the timing of the earthquakes differs, they could still be related.
There is something that geophysicists today call an earthquake sequence or an earthquake storm, in which an earthquake will not relieve all of the stress in a fault, but will simply release part of the stress. And so the next part in the fault will go a year later, 10 years later, and then the fault unzips from east to west or west to east or north to south. And we eventually get what's called an earthquake sequence or an earthquake storm. And these last between 30 and 60 years. Many of the cities that are destroyed by earthquakes are either on a fault line or in a seismically active zone. In fact, if you lay a map of the sites that are destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age by earthquake on top of a map of seismically active zones, they will correlate on very nearly a one-to-one basis.
But the earthquake theory has always had its detractors.
People recover from earthquakes fairly quickly. That's pretty much proven. Even repeated earthquakes.
And to Nowitzki, no natural disaster could explain why a population should move to an even more precarious place.
There's no way that people would move their village 1100 meters to the top of this rock. Why? Escaping from the earthquakes and living on the edge of the rock?